Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In our last episode, we explored what it means to recognize covert narcissistic traits in a parent. We looked at how these dynamics show up at key life transitions, like getting into graduate school, or graduating high school, or even entering a relationship. You and your pleasure, desires, needs can be overshadowed by your parents' distress, subtle criticisms, or emotional manipulation. Instead of being seen and celebrated, your growth becomes a source of guilt, leaving you caught between loyalty to their needs and your own independence. But once you recognize this pattern, a new set of questions inevitably arises. Now what? Do you talk openly with your parent about your needs, your desire to go away to school, spend time with your partner's family, or pursue your own career? Do you gray rock or even consider going no contact? Do you keep trying to fix things so they don't feel hurt or abandoned? And what happens when you stop fixing things? When their sense of victimhood, this is typically what happens, their sense of victimhood intensifies and they complain louder and more, or they become more manipulative. These are the questions we're going to take up today. We'll look at what it actually takes to manage a covertly narcissistic parent without losing yourself in the process. I'll share prototypical examples and walk you through why simply leaving or staying doesn't resolve the deeper issue unless you prepare yourself for mental and emotional separation and loss. Can you imagine that separation and loss may even mean confronting guilt, loosening the role of being the pleaser, the fixer, and addressing the codependent dynamic that keeps you stuck? Can you imagine that? What happens when your own needs feel less important than someone else's? For some, that process leads to going no contact. That's a radical break from their narcissistic parent. More often, particularly with many of the male patients that I see, what I encounter is a more gradual form of no contact. Maybe this is known as gray rocking. And that strategy, they intentionally cut off emotional involvement and make themselves uninteresting to the narcissist. Flat, neutral, and guarded. That's the most important part, guarded. These approaches can bring relief, but I've also found that they often stir guilt, grief, and deep conflict around loyalty and attachment, not just to the parent, but in their current relationships as well. Even when someone cuts off contact or learns to make themselves emotionally unavailable, the underlying patterns don't just disappear. What I've seen over and over is that the relationship with the narcissistic parent lives on inside the person, shaping how they relate to others and even to themselves. In fact, some patients only begin to recognize the narcissism in their parents when they notice those same traits surfacing in their own relationships. Let me share a prototypical example that captures this nicely. How one patient began to see the covert narcissistic dynamics, not first in her parent, but in her own way of relating. But before I jump into that, let me ask you, have you ever noticed patterns from your childhood showing up in your adult relationships? Sometimes a person can first spot covert dynamics not in their parent, but in their own everyday relationships. One patient gave me a striking example of this. She was driving with her husband, stuck in traffic. He was absorbed in his own phone, distracted by work. She noticed herself beginning to huff and puff, complaining about the other drivers and how bad the traffic was. At first, it seemed like she was just simply frustrated with the situation on the road. But when we thought about it later, together, she realized there was something deeper happening. Here's the dynamic hypothesis. While her conscious frustration looked like it was about traffic, the true object of her feeling was about her husband's emotional unavailability in that moment. The traffic became the displaced target, a socially acceptable way to channel her distress. Rather than saying directly, I feel left out, or I would like your attention, or can we talk for a moment? She acted out her need through what? Irritation and annoyance. The sighing and complaining were really indirect communications. What was she saying? See me, engage with me, don't forget about me. What made this moment so powerful was that she could trace it back to her childhood. As she reflected, spontaneous memories surfaced of how her mother's emotional needs were always expressed dramatically. She realized she had internalized, she didn't use that word, but that's what we call it in my field, that style of communication, relying on what? Protest, indirect signals, rather than direct expression of a need. By catching herself in the interaction with her husband, she began to see how these covert, I'm quoting, covert dynamics lived on inside of her and how they linked back to her parent. Have you ever caught yourself reacting strongly to something small, only to realize later it's really about something else? That sense of misdirected frustration is exactly what she began to notice in herself. How old patterns from childhood can quietly shape adult responses. What's so striking here is how she seemingly had this small frustration, right? Like sitting in traffic, but how that becomes a signal flare for something much deeper and more complicated. Her reaction isn't just about being stuck in the car. It's a protest against feeling invisible in the relationship. A moment when she may have unconsciously sensed her partner was emotionally elsewhere. And I say unconsciously because this wasn't even in her awareness until we spoke about it. The frustration, then, is not really about the traffic at all, but it's about the painful experience of losing emotional attunement with her partner. From a psychodynamic perspective, this kind of huffing and puffing and complaining is a desperate bid to restore her connection with her husband. We could say she was pulling for what? Recognition, trying to get her partner to turn toward her, to notice her, to reestablish what matters most in that moment, which was the connection. When we frame this in the context of someone raised by a covertly narcissistic parent, the picture gets clearer. For the child, external validation becomes a kind of lifeline. And you've heard this amongst people who have narcissistic traits, the need for external supplies. The internal experience of vulnerability, feelings of shame, inadequacy, or being overlooked can be so intolerable that the psyche develops strategies to elicit acknowledgement and attention and admiration. It's almost as if the inner logic says, if others acknowledge my struggles, I feel real and significant. If they don't, I feel like I'm invisible or like I'm worthless. This mirrors the covert narcissistic parent's own pattern, expressing distress indirectly through passive complaining or subtle manipulation to do what? To draw others in without appearing overtly needy or vulnerable. And because I cannot fully trust my own inner sense of competence or worth, again, this is the inner logic, I rely on others to confirm it for me. This recreates the learned dynamic of being pulled into another's emotional orbit, responding to their unspoken needs, and prioritizing their validation and making them feel better over authentic self-expression. Typically what happens to a child who grows up with a covert narcissistic parent. To understand the roots of this covert communication, we have to look back at the child's earliest experiences of seeking care and connection. What happens to a child who turns to a parent with excitement or reaches out for comfort, only to be met with what? Dismissal or defensiveness, and then made to feel guilty as if they've done something wrong? When this patient spoke about turning to her mother for help as a child, whether after school or getting ready in the morning. Her mother's responses were often very dismissive or defensive. She would say things like, I'm doing my best to be here for you. You know I have to work extra, right? Since your father left. Or she might say something like, why are you attacking me? Calm down. That's when the patient would express a need, by the way. These moments were not just about a mother who was not helpful. They carried the covert narcissistic signature, deflecting responsibility, positioning herself as overwhelmed or wronged, and subtly shifting the child into the caretaker or apologetic role. As she reflected, as my patient reflected, more memories surfaced. She would wake up to find her mother already gone. She was responsible for herself and her younger sister. When things went wrong, she would try to call her mother at work for guidance. No answer. She would panic, feel alone, anxious, forced to figure it out on her own. This is a classic early experience of overwhelming aloneness. The child reaches for the parent in distress and encounters absence. The emotional message is clear. You are on your own. The result? Feelings of abandonment, helplessness, and forced premature self-reliance. Can you recall a moment where you felt utterly alone, forced to manage on your own, and later realized it shaped how you relate to others? There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next.